Close your eyes for a second and picture the American West 200 years ago. Not empty plains, not quiet grassland. Picture the ground itself shaking, because that's what it actually looked like. Somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison once covered North America, a number so large it's hard to even process. That's more living animals than the entire population of most countries on Earth today, all moving across one continent at the same time. Now, fast forward to tonight. What's actually on your plate? Statistically, probably beef, maybe chicken, maybe pork. When was the last time you saw a buffalo burger on a normal restaurant menu? Not some overpriced novelty spot charging $30 for a wild game experience, just an ordinary place you'd walk into on a random Tuesday. Here's what makes this genuinely strange. A buffalo and a cow are practically cousins, both massive, both plant eaters, both essentially four-legged protein factories. One of them became the backbone of global food supply. The other became a rare specialty item most people have never even tasted. So what actually happened here? Why did an animal that once numbered in the tens of millions basically vanish from our diet, while a completely different species took over the entire planet's dinner plates? The answer isn't one single thing. It's biology, history, and economics all stacking on top of each other at exactly the wrong moment. And once you see how these pieces fit together, you'll never look at a hamburger the same way again. Let's start with the most obvious difference, and it's a big one. You genuinely cannot tame a buffalo. Not the way we tamed cattle. Here's something most people never think about. Cows, as we know them, aren't really a natural animal. They're a human invention. Thousands of years ago, our ancestors took a massive, aggressive wild creature called the auroch and, generation after generation, selectively bred it into something calmer, slower, and far easier to control. That process took centuries of patient, deliberate breeding. The American bison never went through anything like that. It stayed exactly what it always was, a wild, powerful animal built for survival on an open, dangerous landscape. And wild in this case means genuinely intimidating. A full-grown bison can weigh close to 2,000 pounds. It can sprint at speeds over 30 miles an hour, faster than most horses over short distances. It can leap several feet straight up from a standing position and pivot its entire body almost instantly, even at full speed. Now try to picture containing that with a standard wooden fence. Try picturing anyone calmly walking up to a 2,000-pound wild animal to milk it or lead it into a barn. Ranchers who've actually raised bison consistently describe the same experience. These animals treat fences as more of a suggestion than a boundary. A barrier that would easily hold cattle barely slows a determined bison down. A cow, in a strange sense, cooperates with the entire farming system built around it. A buffalo resists every single step of that process. And that one difference alone completely changes whether an animal is realistically farmable at a massive industrial scale. But here's an obvious question. Native American communities lived alongside bison and depended on them for thousands of years. So clearly humans absolutely can make use of this animal. That's completely true. And it leads directly into one of the darker chapters in this whole story. For thousands of years, indigenous nations across the plains built their entire way of life around the bison. Food, clothing, tools, shelter, spiritual traditions, nearly every part of daily life connected back to this one animal. They didn't fence it in or breed it. They followed its migrations, hunted with deep respect, and used almost every part of the animal they took. Then, in the 1800s, everything collapsed with terrifying speed. In just a few short decades, the United States went from tens of millions of wild bison to almost none. By the late 1880s, fewer than 1,000 wild bison remained on the entire continent. Let that number actually sink in for a moment. From roughly 30 million animals down to under 1,000 within a single human lifetime. How did that happen so fast? Commercial hide hunters, the expansion of railroads, and, even more disturbingly, a deliberate military strategy all played a role. Bison were slaughtered on a massive scale for their hides, for sport, and as a calculated tactic to weaken native nations by destroying the animal their entire survival depended on. The logic behind it was brutally simple. Eliminate the buffalo and you cripple an entire way of life along with it. So by the time American food culture was forming into what we'd recognize today, the bison had already been wiped out almost entirely. And cattle, meanwhile, were already everywhere, imported and expanding rapidly across the same land. This is the part people tend to miss. It was never that buffalo meat tasted bad. It's that by the exact moment modern food systems were taking shape, the animal simply wasn't there anymore in any meaningful numbers. The seat at the dinner table had already been permanently claimed. And once a food habit locks into a culture at that scale, scale, it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse. But even the bison that eventually survived came with their own separate set of problems. Let's talk about the actual meat itself for a moment. Real bison meat is genuinely lean, noticeably leaner than most cuts of beef. On paper, that sounds like a clear advantage: lower fat, higher protein, a healthier option all around. But here's the catch almost nobody mentions. Fat carries flavor. Fat is what keeps a steak juicy under high heat. Fat is what makes a burger stay moist instead of turning into a dry, chewy disappointment. Bison simply doesn't have much of that built-in cushion. So if you cook it exactly the way you'd cook a beef steak, it dries out fast, turns tough, and becomes genuinely unpleasant to eat. People cooking bison for the first time almost universally make this exact mistake. They treat it like beef, apply the same heat and timing, and the meat punishes them for it immediately. Even during the periods when bison meat was actually available commercially, it developed a lasting reputation as something gamey, tricky, and unforgiving to prepare. And reputations like that tend to stick around for generations, long after the underlying problem could easily be solved with the right technique. Now compare all of that to a cow. Beef is almost engineered for forgiveness. Marbled fat runs through the meat, making it far more resistant to overcooking. You can genuinely overcook a cheap cut of beef, and it's still perfectly edible. Cattle, in a very real sense, made themselves easy to work with. Bison demanded skill, patience, and precision that most home cooks and restaurants simply weren't willing to invest in. And humans, generally speaking, gravitate toward whatever requires the least effort for a reliable result. But even taste and cooking difficulty aren't the biggest piece of this puzzle. The real reason cattle won this competition runs much deeper than flavor. Here's the part almost nobody stops to think about. A cow isn't just an animal anymore. It's essentially a finely tuned piece of agricultural machinery. Cattle breed on predictable schedules. They gain weight at consistent, manageable rates. They stand calmly in enclosed pens. They load onto trucks without a fight. Every single part of the modern farming system, the fencing, the feedlots, the transportation networks, the slaughterhouses, the entire supply chain stretching from birth to your dinner plate was engineered specifically around cattle behavior. Now, try inserting a bison into that exact same system. It doesn't fit. It jumps standard fencing meant for cattle. It becomes highly stressed in tight confinement. It grows more slowly. It requires significantly more open space per animal. Every single step of the process becomes more expensive, more dangerous for workers, and less predictable than it is with cattle. To raise bison at true industrial scale, you'd essentially need to rebuild large portions of the entire agricultural infrastructure specifically to accommodate a fundamentally wilder animal. And from a pure business standpoint, there was never a compelling reason to do that when cattle already worked perfectly well within the existing system. So cattle didn't win this competition because they tasted better than bison. They won because they were cheaper to raise, safer to handle, more predictable to farm, and critically, they were already established and thriving by the time modern food culture fully took shape. The buffalo never lost a taste test to the cow. It lost an economic and logistical argument decades before most people were even paying attention to the outcome. So is buffalo completely gone from modern diets? Not entirely. And the exceptions here are genuinely fascinating. Bison farming has actually made a real comeback in recent decades. There are dedicated ranchers across North America who specialize in raising bison specifically for meat. You can now find bison burgers in some grocery stores and restaurants, typically marketed as a leaner, higher protein, more natural alternative to traditional beef. But notice exactly how it gets sold. It's positioned as a specialty item, a premium option, a treat-yourself upgrade, rather than an everyday staple. It's essentially never the default choice on a menu, and it's almost always priced noticeably higher than standard beef. And here's the genuinely remarkable part of this whole story. The only reason bison exist in meaningful numbers today at all is because a small group of dedicated ranchers, conservationists, and native nations fought deliberately to pull the species back from the edge of extinction. From fewer than 1,000 animals in the late 1800s, the population has since recovered to somewhere around 500,000 bison today. But it's important to understand what that recovery actually looks like. The overwhelming majority of those animals live in carefully managed herds on private ranches or protected conservation land, not roaming freely across open plains the way they once did in massive, uncontrolled numbers. So even this comeback story quietly proves the original point. Bison never became a dietary staple again. It became something closer to a survivor story, an animal we very nearly erased entirely from the continent, now sold back to us decades later as a premium luxury item. So why don't we eat buffalo the way we eat beef? It's not because the meat is dangerous, it's not because it's unpleasant when properly prepared. Cooked correctly, bison is genuinely excellent. The real answer is everything surrounding the animal itself. We never managed to tame it, so large-scale farming never developed the way it did with cattle. We nearly wiped the species out entirely during exactly the period when modern food culture was forming, so it simply wasn't available when the dinner table was being permanently set. Its naturally lean meat earned it an unfair reputation as difficult and unforgiving to cook. And cattle, meanwhile, were simply easier at every single stage of the process. Easier to farm, easier to transport, easier to cook, easier to scale. Biology pushed in one direction. History pushed in that same direction. Economics confirmed it. And once all three forces align, the outcome becomes almost impossible to reverse, regardless of how the story could have gone differently. Here's the detail that genuinely stays with me. There were once tens of millions of these animals moving across an entire continent, literally shaking the ground beneath them. They were, quite literally, the heartbeat of the American plains for thousands of years. And in barely a single century, we transformed them into a rare novelty item found occasionally on an upscale restaurant menu. The buffalo didn't disappear from our plates because it wasn't good enough. It disappeared because we arrived at a critical moment too fast, moved too aggressively, and ultimately built our entire modern food system around something that happened to be easier to control. So the next time you order a regular beef burger without even thinking twice about it, remember that the animal on your plate isn't there because it won some kind of fair competition. It's there because it was simply easier to work with, right at the exact moment history needed an answer. The buffalo never actually lost. We just moved on before it ever really got the chance to compete. Drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever actually tried bison meat? And if so, how did it compare to beef? And if this video changed the way you think about what ends up on your plate and why, hit subscribe, because the next story is going to surprise you just as much.